All right, everyone. So we're now on to speciation. And let's go ahead and get to the PowerPoint. Okay, so let's start with the first concept here. So if we're going to define speciation, and I know that I don't have it down on here, but now would be a really good time to write it down. Speciation is the process of a species diverging into two separate species. So what happens here is that you have a population and something's going to happen to the population. I'll go back to this one here. So this here is a node and something happens. So at the node here, we have one species. Something happens and the species will diverge into two separate species. Or perhaps at this node here, perhaps the species will stay the same over here, but a new species will diverge here. So what happens here is that something happens, and it could be a lot of things. We'll talk about some possibilities or some reasons why speciation occurs. But if we're going to define a species, so very important, a species um, is defined as any life forms that can mate and create fertile offspring. If that's the case, then they are considered members of the same species, meaning that they have to have very similar DNA, they have to have the same number of chromosomes. Genetically, they need to be very similar. If that is not the case, then they are not members of the same species. So, once again, species are comprised of any organisms that can mate and create fertile offspring. And if we look, is some species are not very genetically diverse, but others are. So I'm going to type in here, just in this box here, I'm going to type in dog species. So yeah, fun story. One of my favorite books in elementary school was called the New Dog Handbook. And it just had all these different breeds of dogs, and I just really like to read it. I must have taken it out at the school library like 4 or 5 times. Yeah, just a fun fact for you all. All right, cool. So if we look here, look at all these different species of dogs. And believe it or not, this might kind of shock you, but all of these can intermate with each other. You can literally have a little lion dog mate with a Brussels griffin, and you can create fertile offspring. That's how quote unquote mutts are produced when two purebred species, when they mate and interbreed, it creates a cross species. So there are many, many, many different types of dog breeds. I like the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel because the name is cool. But you can mate any sort of dog breed that you like, and it will create fertile offspring. Most dogs are actually the result of what is called what is known as artificial selection, where dogs are bred in a certain way to get certain traits. Now, what's kind of humiliating for the dog or dog shows. Here you have these animals that were derived from wolves, and now they literally are looking like just these hunters, these predators that survived due to being ferocious and being good hunters. Now they are now they are reduced to this. Let's look at some. And if you do like dog shows, there's nothing wrong with that. I just find it a bit ironic, I guess. So, whoa, what is that? Well, that looks like some kind of dog that has probably had more money and time dedicated to its hairdo than I have in the past like 5 years. Wow, very impressive. All right, I'm digressing here. Other animals are not nearly as genetically diverse. We are to look up cheetah diversity. There's literally none. Cheetahs are basically clones of each other, which is very interesting. In fact, we're actually working really hard to save cheetahs because since they're not genetically diverse, they're actually being wiped out by a single virus. All right, so anyways, back to our PowerPoint. So speciation doesn't mean that all because the animals don't look the same, that doesn't mean that they are not members of the same species, because what's most important is the ability to mate and create fertile offspring. So now that we know the definition of a species, that's now, well, way before that, there was a concept called the morphological species concept. And this is a very simple concept. It states that if animals look similar to each other, then they're members of the same species. That's actually how they were classified way back ago. So we're talking 200-300 years ago. Before we had the ability to build phylogenetic trees and things like that. So we just said, so these two animals look alike, so they must be members of the same species. So we know now that the morphological species concept, even though it is correct much of the time, it is not a slam dunk way to differentiate species, because animals can look similar but not be similar. You might think that, for example, the panda bear's closest living relative is, I don't know, the brown bear. Not the case. Believe it or not, the giant panda's most similar relative is the red panda, also known as the lesser panda if you're going to use more of the scientific terms. So if we look here, giant panda, closest relatives. So if we look here just for fun, let me show you guys. Yeah, anyway, so if we look here just for fun, the closest living relative to the giant panda is going to be, I don't feel like looking up scientific notation. See if I can find it here. Okay, it doesn't include the red panda. Well, actually, the giant panda and the polar bear are very genetically similar. I gotta look up. I mean, I'm just doing this really sort of quickly without verifying sources. But I'm sure that the red panda is the closest relative to the giant panda. I gotta see what kind of basis they're building this on. Let's look here. Now I'm bothered. Well, I have to look at this more closely. But anyways, the red panda is a very similar. Yeah. Okay. Actually, I was wrong. Apparently, is on this criteria here is the common ancestor diverged into two other ancestral species, and they became raccoons, red pandas, giant pandas, and bears. So, anyways, it is still true that raccoons and red pandas are genetically similar to giant pandas and bears. So I was a little bit wrong there. Okay, I apologize. I have egg on my face, I guess they say. But all because they don't look the same does not mean that they are not genetically similar, which is why that the morphological species concept is not really true as far as defining members of species. So it made sense, and as I said, most of the time it's correct, but not all the time. So we can't really just look at species that look similar being members of the same species, or else we'd be classifying sharks and dolphins as members of the same species when really they aren't even closely related. Now, how does the speciation occur? Well, it's something called reproductive isolation. So what happens here is that a population is somehow separated. And as a result, let me see if I can find something here. Well, actually, this is the types of speciation. So, anyways, what happens is that they are going to um, be separated somehow. And because they're separated, what's going to happen is that they are going to accumulate differences because once they're separated, their environments are different. They're going to accumulate small differences over time that over thousands and thousands of years will make them so different that they will be unable to mate. There's a number of reasons that can cause that. But anyway, speciation must be caused by reproductive isolation, meaning that they're physically separated. Because of that, they cannot reproduce. The two populations will incur differences that will actually make them so different that they're actually not reproductively compatible anymore. I guess one way to think of it is when you and your good friends from high school, when they when you go off to separate colleges. So maybe in high school you were super close friends, like the same things, you hung out with the same people, talked about the same bands. I don't know what you guys talk about now. But anyways, when you first go off to separate colleges, after that first semester, you all come back for break, and they're still pretty much the same person. Then you go back after the first year during the summer. You still have a lot in common, but you notice that there's small differences. And then you leave again, and you come back for the second year. That break, you find that they're just a little bit more different until every time you see them, after a semester in college, is they just seem to be becoming a different person, and you're becoming a different person to the point where you have so little in common because of so much time spent in different environments. You have so little in common that really you don't have enough in common to continue the friendship. Unfortunately, that happens very often. I think it's common to drift away from your childhood friends and grow closer to friends that you make in college. I'm grateful that I'm still friends with many of my high school buddies and college buddies. But what's interesting, and I know I'm going on a tangent here. What's interesting is that, and you guys might find this too. I actually became better friends with high school acquaintances that I was not super close with um, at school, but I became close with years after high school. So you might find the same thing as maybe some friends from high school that you kind of hung around with, but not that often. They might end up later on becoming some of your best friends, which shows you how interesting life works. Anyway, speciation. So as I was saying, is that for speciation to occur, reproductive isolation must occur. When reproductive isolation occurs and the two populations cannot interbreed, then small differences over time will accumulate, which will result in them becoming reproductively incompatible. So the first one, the most clear-cut one, is called allopatric speciation. And in this one, something occurs, it could be anything. Something occurs where a barrier forms that separates a population into two parts. So what's going to happen is that since this barrier is preventing um, the population from crossing over and reproducing together, eventually they're going to become two separate species. So the barrier is going to take one population and split it into two over time because of just random evolution and different environments. Is each population that was separated, each side of the population, they're going to accumulate more and more differences over a long time until they become two separate species. So this is caused by a physical separation that prevents members of the separated population from crossing over and mating. The next one is a bit different. So this is called sympatric speciation. And in this case here, the population actually is not separated. But despite that, you are still going to have speciation occur. This is not, this might seem like, well, wait a second, how does that happen? Could be from anything. It could be from specialized food sources. It could be from a natural disaster that changed the environment. It could be from niche specialization. So maybe like some birds, they'll eat seeds at the top of the tree, and other birds will eat seeds at the bottom of the tree. So it could be lots of things, but sympatric speciation occurs when there's no separation in the environment, yet the population still branches off into separate species. One cause of sympatric speciation is called disruptive selection. Now, what happens here is that in a population, let's say that there is a bell curve as far as beak size go. So birds that have that have smaller beaks are less common than birds that have medium beaks. And birds that have larger beaks are less common than, well, birds that have medium beaks. So what this tells us is that this population, if the bird had a beak size that was too small, it had a hard time surviving. And if it had a beak size that was too large, it had a hard time surviving. Therefore, birds that had medium-sized beaks were, for whatever reason, most successful at getting food. Now, what happened here is some kind of natural disaster happened, or man-made disaster, whatever. And the result is that medium-sized beaks actually became less efficient at getting food, whereas birds with small beaks and large beaks became better at obtaining food, meaning that having a really small beak or a really large beak helped you obtain food better. Think of it similar to Giraffe Island. Is if something happens, then that severely disrupts the environment, hence disruptive selection, and they can change the environment enough where the average trait, the most common one, goes down and the outliers go up. But this happens with a significant change in the environment. So this disruptive selection definitely notes that it is a form of sympatric speciation. Another form of sympatric speciation is something that mainly happens in plants and is called polyploidy. It's very weird. What happens is that for whatever reason, a plant species will double its chromosomes. And it will have 4 chromosomes instead of 2. We call that a tetraploid. Why this happens, it could be a lot of things. But what this does, very interesting, is it makes it so only plants that are tetraploid can reproduce with each other. Because for whatever reason, when this plant doubled its chromosomes, that's the only way that plant now can produce offspring, is if they all have 4 chromosomes. The problem is if a plant that evolved to be a tetraploid tried to pollinate a plant that was diploid, it would create something called a triploid. And a triploid is not reproductively viable. Three chromosomes cannot make the proper distribution of gametes, which will prevent a viable offspring from forming. So this happens spontaneously. This happens because of an error in meiosis. The plant has 4 chromosomes instead of 2, And what happens is that if this plant is a tetraploid, that means it can only reproduce with plants that are tetraploid. If it attempts to reproduce with a plant that's diploid, it's going to create a triploid, which is not reproductively viable. So that's another form of speciation. Okay, now we're going to dive more into the factors that can cause speciation to occur. And keep in mind that happens in stages. So much like how it went with the college friend example, is these differences accumulate over time until they make the species so different that they're just not able to reproduce. And when we talk about um, uh, reproductive isolation, remember these are things that um, eventually cause the species to be unable to reproduce together. We further break that down into prezygotic and postzygotic. Definitely note prezygotic is um, before the sperm fuses with the egg. So this actually prevents any sort of reproductive act from happening. So that is prezygotic. Postzygotic is the organisms have successfully mated, and sperm actually has met with the egg and has fertilized it. But what's going to happen is that the species are so different. They have different numbers of chromosomes. They have significantly different genes that the zygote will not become viable and will not progress with the process of becoming an embryo. It will stop right there. So let's talk about some prezygotic isolating mechanisms. And the first is temporal. Um, Believe it or not, many species are not able to reproduce whenever they want to. They must go through periods where they are in, I think the term used to be called in heat. But organisms, species, they actually, some of them have very specific times when they can mate. Now, if a population is split and becomes reproductively isolated, they might develop different temporal periods for mating, and if the temporal periods do not align, then they will be unable to mate and create fertile offspring. Now, next is ecological. This is basically the fact that they just don't ever meet. So what happens is that they occupy such different habitats that there's really no reason why they would meet. Of course, that's changing. That is changing, because due to human activities, yes, us, is we are continually forcing species to migrate and settle elsewhere, and that's why coyotes and wolves are now mating, creating something called a coy wolf. And that's a problem because coy wolves are actually invasive because they have the speed and power of a wolf, but the cunningness of a coyote. So they're actually great hunters, and because they're such great hunters, they're reproducing so fast that they're actually taking over the ecosystems in which they reside. Next is behavioral. Certain species have very specific requirements of what they expect from a mate, and birds, for example, are very picky about things like the type of bird song, the type of dance, the type of appearance. If reproductive isolation occurs and the courtship behaviors become too different, then the female will reject the courtship ritual and no mating will occur. I guess it's kind of like, let's say that you are, because of course, as we'll talk about, females choose the males, and that's very true as far as most mammalian species. is, let's say that you see somebody that, I don't know, is a TikTok famous man or whatever, and you might think that his style, his talents, you might think that that is really great attributes, really something desirable. But if somebody from the 1920s um, just went into a time warp and came out here in 2021 and tipped his hat and basically said, "Good day, madam. Do you know where the do you want to go to the ball and dance? Um, I don't know, dance in the dance hall with his like 1920 stuff on." You probably would be saying, "Gosh, this guy's talking weird. He's dressed weird. He's acting weird." So, because you're from a different time periods, is what you consider our normal behaviors are different, and you probably would not want to associate with the gentleman from the 1920s. So that just shows you that the more time has gone by since a population was one, and as you know, when they are split, they are reproductively isolated. If their behaviors change enough, then the behaviors will be rejected by the female, and reproduction will not occur. This is one I'm not even going to make a joke out of. Mechanical. Let's just say um, that the pieces do not fit together, and we'll just go ahead and leave it at that. We're not going to talk about too much of the post-zygotic isolating mechanisms. The only thing that you really need to know is that the offspring um, uh, is not going to be viable. Either it's going to stop when it is newly fertilized, or it's going to stop um, when it is born. So just note that um, whatever happens with post zygotic isolation, it's either not going to form into a viable offspring, it's not going to to be able to live until adulthood, or it's not going to be able to reproduce either. So, for example, when horses and donkeys mate, they can create a hybrid called a mule, but mules are not able to reproduce. They're actually sterile. So these are the prezygotic and postzygotic isolating mechanisms that over time um, prevent members of two different species from mating. So if any of these prezygotic isolating mechanisms or postzygotic isolating mechanisms are in place, then it's going to prevent the species from successfully mating and creating fertile offspring. Some other things that can cause speciation to occur. The first is something called cross pollination, and cross pollination is when the pollen from one plant um, fertilizes the ovary of the other plant. So what happens is that it is going to increase genetic diversity by bringing the genes from one plant to another plant. And that's why, for example, we have so many different species of apples, for example, because of cross-pollination. So self-pollination creates clones, where cross-pollination creates genetic diversity. Also, and this is something to note, it is a concept called sexual selection, which is an example of mating behaviors. Now, what happens is that females, what they do is that they choose the males that they will mate with. What they choose or what their criteria for choosing are different depending on the species, but generally they look for very specific traits. Like, for example, in the case of peacocks, it's the peacock males that have the largest feathers. They're the ones that are most desirable by the female. But as you can see here, the female bird looks drastically different. Sorry, the female peacock looks drastically different than the male peacock. And you're probably saying, well, why is that? And the answer is that the male is trying to impress the female, not the other way around. So there's no pressure on the female to evolve more colorful traits because the male doesn't care. The male's job is to impress the female. So what this does over time is it actually makes males and females different from one another. We call this sexual dimorphism, which explains why males and females of certain species look so much different. And those are also factors that can increase the rate of evolution. All right, well, hope you guys enjoyed this lecture. And this is the last chapter that will be on the exam. So yeah, over and out.